The book of Ruth is a short piece of history that details for us one of the most important lessons from this part of Jewish history. We're going to cover it in two sections, both times talking about the entire story, but looking at the story from two different angles. First, let's discuss the story we've always heard. It's a positive story of hope, joy, and redemption. We'll also discuss the story from a more contextual standpoint. This book it places itself right there in the context of the time of the judges, and that's a time when there's little hope and little joy, but we'll still find a theme of redemption. But for this lesson, we're going to do the first one. We're going to talk about the hope, joy, and redemption that comes from the story we've always heard. The story begins with the phrase, during the time of the judges. That's in chapter 1, verse 1. The main character, as we open the story, is Naomi, a woman who has experienced hardship. She's left her home, the homeland, because of a famine. And while she and her husband and her two sons are away, her husband dies. Her two sons marry Moabite women, but these sons also die. And that story leaves us very quickly with three grieving widows. Naomi encourages her young daughters-in-law to return home and find new husbands. You find that Ruth, though, shows a determined amount of loyalty to her mother-in-law, and she makes that famous statement we find in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. Don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you, for wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me and do so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. This remarkable loyalty is a unique characteristic, and it defines Ruth as a great example of character within the book. She returns to with Naomi to Israel, or rather Mara, because Naomi renames herself with a name that means bitter. They return at the time of the barley harvest, which is one of the first statements of hope, and a glimpse that things are going to turn out well. Chapter 2 begins the story with a story of God's redemption. Naomi continues to grieve, and Ruth continues to display her loyalty. She goes to the fields to harvest grain, as poor people are allowed to do according to God's law. That's found back in Leviticus chapter 19. Ruth is a hard worker, and she's noticed by the owner of the field because of that hard work. That owner is Boaz, and he takes an interest in her specifically because of several traits he mentioned. One is her hard work, her diligence. The second one is that she is family. She is his family because he is related to her father-in-law, and then also because of the immense amount of care she has shown for Naomi, how she has loved her mother-in-law. And he encourages her to glean only from his field where he can watch over her and make sure that she remains safe. There are hints at this point in the story that there may be some sort of romantic connection. Boaz invites her to come and eat with him, to dip bread with him. He even provides extra food for her to take home to Naomi. And when Ruth arrives home with that large amount of food, Naomi starts to connect the dots. She says, "May the Lord bless him because he has not abandoned his kindness to the living or the dead." And she continues, "This man is a close relative. He's one of our family redeemers." As you know, family redeemers were those who were allowed to engage in the process of Levirate marriages. That's outlined in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. And it was God's way to provide an heir for a deceased man who had no heir to carry on his name, to carry on his family, to inherit the land. That was his blessing. Well, to move forward with that process, Naomi instructs Ruth to meet Boaz at night and to, quote, uncover his feet. Some view that as an act of submission or kindness, and she shows a quiet and gentle heart in the way that she treats Boaz very gently, uncovering his feet, having that late night conversation where she essentially asked him to marry her. And that concept of redemption becomes really a theme of the story, and at this point, the central point on which the whole story is built. Naomi sends Ruth to Boaz to express to him her willingness to marry him, if he's willing to marry her. And he lets her know that he is willing, and then he proceeds with that lawfully on the following day. Boaz, being a righteous man, knows that there's a kinsman who's closer in relation to Naomi than himself, and so he does not want to step on that man's territory. He basically goes and gets permission from that man. That man declines the marriage of Ruth and the care of Naomi, and therefore Boaz is now free to pursue a Levirate marriage, and he does, and he marries Ruth, and they have a son named Obed, and the child, their child, is the grandfather of the one who will eventually become King David. This story is a bit of a literary masterpiece. It teaches several things. One is that God can redeem. He can redeem any situation, no matter how hopeless, and we find that in this story. God takes a woman who's lost all hope, and he makes her life good again. And at the beginning of the story, she names herself bitter. At the end, the women are blessing her and saying, "Blessed be the Lord who's not left you without a family redeemer today. May his name become well known in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age." Second lesson is that God can use anyone. All three of the main characters in this story are deficient in some sort of way. Naomi is a woman who has suffered the loss of everything she has ever had. Ruth is a Moabitess, a foreigner, one of a nation who are known as prostitutes and lewd women. That comes primarily from the story of their origin, which is Lot's daughters seducing him to produce heirs for themselves. And then the story of the Israelites prostituting themselves with the Moabite women in Numbers 25. That's directly after the story of Balaam and Balak. Boaz was himself deficient because he's an unmarried man and apparently was able to marry but just had not been able to get married, or maybe even possibly was a widower himself, although it doesn't say that. It also seems he doesn't have heirs of his own, and in all three of those cases God uses those men and women to accomplish his will. The third lesson that you have is that God's will eventually be accomplished. Interestingly, God is not identified really as doing anything in this story. Several people in the story talk about God, but God himself is not actually seen acting in any way. Yet we know, because of faith, that God was actually behind all of the good things that happened in the story and all of the redemption that happened in the story. It really is a literary masterpiece, and it's designed to help us see God's hope in the midst of a bunch of horrible stories that you see through the book of Judges of those who have deserted God. Always remember that God is present, God is active, and God is busy helping his people. And whether we are depressed like Naomi, or hopeless like Ruth, or heirless like Boaz, God can still do amazing things.